On August 10, 2018, Seattle-Tacoma International Airport looked like any other summer evening. The sun dipped low over Puget Sound, painting the sky in gold and shadowing the busy runways. Inside, travelers passed the time with coffee, waiting for their flights. Outside, the routine hum of ground operations carried on as usual. Among the crew working that evening was Richard Russell, known affectionately as Bebo by friends and colleagues. At just 28, Richard's life seemed steady and full. He grew up in Wasilla, Alaska, was married, pursuing college classes online, and deeply involved in his local church community. To those who knew him, he was the kind of person who brought humor and warmth wherever he went, a playful spirit wrapped in loyalty and kindness. At Horizon Air, Richard's role was that of a ground service agent on the tow team, a position that demanded versatility. He hauled luggage, guided aircraft to their stands, and maneuvered heavy planes across the apron using the pushback tug. The work was tough, often overlooked, and far from glamorous, but Richard embraced it. His colleagues appreciated his easygoing nature, his habit of cracking jokes, and the lighthearted videos he'd post online, always ready to make others smile. Ooh, a purple one. To his employer, he was likely just another airport worker in a reflective vest, someone that you might pass by on the ramp and never think twice about. And that, in hindsight, is part of what makes this story so troublesome. You see, Russell, through his work, had unrestricted access to what's known as the airside. That's the secure part of the airport, where aircraft are parked, serviced, and maintained. Like thousands of other airline employees across the country, he'd been issued an employee badge after his initial background screening, and that was basically that. He was in, and no one would have thought to question it any further, unless something special turned up. Now the ramp employees did go through a standard security screening, similar to what passengers do before entering the airside every day that they came to work. But after that, they could go just about anywhere they wanted on the ramp that wasn't specifically barred from them. This is something known in the industry as airside access, and it's worth understanding exactly what that means. You see, airport employees, security can broadly be categorized into a few different groups, and each one of those groups gets a different rigor and level of detail for the security background checks. The first level are checks done for employees working at things like fast food restaurants or retail shops inside of the terminal. Those checks tend to be a bit lighter, as these workers generally only need clearance to enter the sterile areas beyond the passenger security checkpoints, but not to the ramps outside. The next level of scrutiny is used for so-called airside staff like Russell was, and those do have access to the secure airside areas where planes are parked and loaded and maintained. The majority of the vetting for airside staff focus on preventing crimes like theft, smuggling, or help to move contraband, not necessarily on screening for mental health issues or psychological risk factors. So it is important to note that these employees are not subjected to the same psychological screenings that are given to the final and most scrutinized groups, the flight crews, cabin crews, and air traffic controllers. But having said that, it is unclear if even those type of psychological screenings would have been able to detect what Richard Russell was now about to embark on, and absolutely nothing in his demeanor, social relationships, or hobbies gave any clues either. According to all accounts, he was a perfectly lovely young man, maybe missing home in Alaska a little bit, but nothing else. Now, before we go any further, I want to point out that we had to do research for this episode in a slightly different way than we normally do. And that was because there is no official NTSB report for this incident, only interviews, FBI files, and articles. And I want to give a special shout out to an article in the Rolling Stone by Tim Dickinson, and I will link to it in the description here below. Anyway, I still really wanted to tell this story because I think that it highlights some weaknesses in our security protocols, but also because I am very passionate about highlighting mental health issues and the fact that we need to be on the alert for people around us who might need our help and support. Anyway, now you know a short background story on Richard Russell. But what about the aircraft that will soon take center stage in this story? Well, this was a gleaming Bombardier Dash 8, which is a comparatively modern aircraft, and just like any airliners today, it would be considered quite complex to start up and handle. But for someone with time, access, and curiosity, the most basic processes wouldn't be impossible to learn, which is worth remembering. The Dash 8 400 series, also called the Q400, is a medium-sized twin turboprop, built by Bombardier in Canada. It has two Pratt & Whitney PW150 engines and a range of about 1,100 nautical miles. At the time of this story, it was the workhorse of the Horizon fleet, where it was tasked with short hops all over the northwestern West Coast. And like many regional aircraft, these planes were sometimes left parked on remote stands between flights away from the terminal building. Now, when that was the case, they weren't guarded or locked, because why would they be? The assumption was that anyone present airside would be authorized to be there, and even if someone was to get on board, the worry was more about tampering with the plane or stealing parts from it, not actually stealing the plane. That trust of airport employees like Russell actually extended to the use of certain aircraft systems as well, like the APU, the auxiliary power units. For example, this is a small jet engine fitted to provide the aircraft with pneumatic power and electricity when the main engines are running. And it would have been unusual for a ramp employee with the right training to be allowed to start up the APU in order to facilitate a tow of the aircraft, for example, or to heat it up in the cold mornings. So, seeing someone in a high-vis vest entering the aircraft and starting it up would not necessarily have raised any eyebrows. But, of course, the APU can also be used to start the aircraft's engines, if you know how to. Before we continue, here is an interesting bit of trivia. Technically, the APU was an optional feature on the Q400, but in reality, no Q400 have ever left the Bombardier factory without one fitted, since it was simply considered too useful. That's compared with another popular regional turboprop, the ATR-72, which unlike the Q400, doesn't have an APU at all. So it either has to be connected to external ground power or run one of its main engines just to keep the lights and systems on while sitting on the ramp. Obviously, not ideal. It is actually hard for me to even imagine operations without access to an APU on a daily basis. And similarly, it's also hard for me to imagine operating this channel without access to today's sponsor, NordVPN. Nord has been helping to power this channel for a while now, and we also use it in our research when we come up against geo-blocked articles, research papers, or videos. With Nord, we can easily move ourselves virtually to get the access that we need, or to find the best prices on hotels, flights, and rental cars, since those can vary wildly depending on from where you are booking. Nord also provides powerful cybersecurity tools, something that's becoming more and more important for every day. Now, in one of those, the Threat Protection Pro will help protect you even if the VPN is not being actively used. With hundreds of servers in over 60 countries, Nord's services are lightning fast, and you can use the same plan on 10 different devices, protecting your whole family with it. Right now, you, my viewers, will get 4 extra months for free when you use this QR code. Or go to nordvpn.com/pilot and sign up for the 2-year plan. Thank you so much, Nord. Now let's continue the story. Now we know from interviews conducted later that Russell had spent quite some time watching cockpit videos on YouTube. He was also a fan of video games, including flight simulators, and he had posted lighthearted clips from the ramp, joking around about his job and the little quirks of working at an airport. And while none of that raised any alarms at the time, it would later become quite clear that Russell was far more curious and far more capable than any one of his colleagues or managers had realized. But there had also been some red flags. A pilot for SkyWest Airlines, who according to the Seattle Times, spoke to the authorities later, had twice found Russell inside of the cockpit of his plane. When it had been parked at SeaTac once, Russell had even asked if he could observe him doing the pre-flight flows. And another time he had found Russell and another ramp worker in the cockpit flipping switches. Now with the benefit of hindsight, this was obviously not good, but at the time, I can see how it would have been easy to just disregard that as the deep interest of someone being really into aviation. And remember, he would have likely been trained to operate things like the APU and lights, for example, so he might have been allowed to do some switching in there when needed, of course. But just as important as the preparation work, it seems like Russell had done was what he hadn't done. It doesn't appear like he had any kind of grand plan of what he wanted to achieve with his coming stunt, even though his preparation and curiosity seems to suggest that at least some kind of idea might have existed in his mind for some time. And here is really where that larger picture begins to take shape, not just of one man's actions, but of the environment that he operated in, an environment where background checks happened only once, where mental health support was basically non-existent, and where the boundaries between curiosity and capability were always obvious. Anyway, that was the world that Russell was a part of, and on that quiet Friday afternoon, he went to work one last time. He clocked in just before 14:30 local time in Seattle for a standard shift, moving bags, helping to tow planes around, and generally keep the ramp running smoothly. No one noticed anything different about him at all. He was friendly with coworkers, waved to people on the apron, and made small talk here and there, just like he always did. But what nobody knew was that at some point during that day, Russell must have made up his mind. He was now going for it. So, at around 19:15, just as the afternoon shift was giving way to early evening, he left his normal work area and made his way towards a quiet corner of the airfield. A remote stand, known as 1A, which was located far away from the bustle of the passenger terminal and parked on that stand, was a Bombardier Q400 with tail number N449QX. This aircraft was operated by Horizon Air, Alaska Airlines' wholly owned regional subsidiary, and earlier on that day, it had completed its last scheduled flight from Vancouver Island back over to Seattle. It was scheduled to fly again on the next day, but at this point it was unoccupied and just parked there possibly for some light maintenance work or just to be out of the way until it was needed to be used again. Like I mentioned before, there were no security guards monitoring the aircraft directly, but there were surveillance cameras pointed towards it. The guard that was on duty was, at the time, busy helping a vehicle gain access through a gate at a different part of the airport. But like I explained earlier, even if you would have been watching the cameras, there wouldn't have been anything strange with a ramp worker approaching the aircraft with a tow truck, attaching it and then firing up the APU. Maybe the airline required the aircraft for a flight, or maybe something else like maintenance. The security guard would have had no idea. Anyway, once Russell arrived to the aircraft, he started by removing the wheel chokes. He then connected his tug to the nose wheel and after that opened up the plane and went inside to start up the APU. He then must have used whatever knowledge that he had gained from those YouTube videos and flight simulators to configure the aircraft enough to be able to start up its engines. Like I said before, this would not have been straightforward, as you need to do all steps in more or less the correct order, and also understand how the bleed air from the APU needs to be configured in order to do that successfully. The aircraft must have also had some fuel left in its tank from its earlier flight, or it could have been pre-fueled for the next one. It's hard to know, but likely it didn't have that much fuel, as we will soon see. Now the reason that we don't know exactly what he did here or how much fuel that there was on board is again because we didn't get access to the final report or printouts from the flight data recorder. But it turns out that it's not that important anyway. What we do know though is that Richard did get both engines running before going outside again and using his tug to turn the aircraft around, facing the taxiway and runway that he was intending to use. When he disconnected the tug, since the engines were now running, and there was no one in the cockpit to hold the brakes like it normally would be, the aircraft started moving. So he had to make a quick dash to the L1 door, close the door behind him, and then get seated in the captain's chair to keep it from running away from him. And that would likely have been the only thing so far that would have looked strange on the surveillance cameras. But like I said, there was no one there looking. Now we will never know for sure what he was thinking at that moment, whether it was a pure impulse or part of a plan, but what's clear is that from here on, his actions were deliberate and he was committed. He still could have stopped the sequence of events here. Yeah, he would have probably gotten fired and likely prosecuted for what he had already done, but he would have survived it. But the thing is that sometimes we humans have a tendency to commit to even really stupid things. This is something similar to the sunk cost fallacy, where you think that I'm too deep into this now, I can't stop, but in reality you can and likely should stop. Anyway, the Q400 isn't exactly a beginner-friendly airplane. It's a complex machine that takes experienced pilots months to train in order to operate safely. But Richard had apparently done his homework here. Like I said, he had spent time on flight simulators, read through public aircraft manuals, and watched countless hours of cockpit footage online. So over time, piece by piece, it's likely that he had picked up enough knowledge to get the plane moving and in a configuration that would also allow it to get airborne. Now he obviously didn't have a pilot license, and as far as the investigators could find, he had never taken any formal flight training. But he knew just enough, and the systems on board were not designed to stop him. Like I said in the beginning, the Q400, like any airliner, doesn't have any ignition key or lock of any kind. Security for airliners is instead based entirely around never letting the wrong kind of person near the plane in the first place. Something that had obviously failed here. But I want to emphasize that apart from Russell's intent here, the underlying system had worked as intended. It had just failed to realize that an inside threat could manifest itself in this way, similar to how the horrible actions of the first officer on board Germanwings Flight 9525 had never been considered a possibility until it happened 3 years before this. Anyway, while all of this was going on, none of his colleagues had initially noticed that Russell was missing. And that wasn't an oversight. It was likely just normal at the time. Ramp workers like Russell operated largely unsupervised, and I have actually worked on the ramp in the same capacity myself back home in Sweden, and I can attest to the fact that as long as you are present when it's time to work, like to load or unload an arrival, no one would have cared much about what I was doing. Anyway, at time 1932, N449QX now suddenly began to move forward towards the runway. At first, it didn't raise any alarms. The plane rolled slowly from its stand, taxiing across the apron, as it's repositioning for maintenance or relocation. And these kind of ground movements are common at large airports. Even though as soon as it enters into the maneuver area, like the active apron, taxiways, and definitely the runway, it would have needed to have a clearance from air traffic control. But outside of that area, and from a distance, it would possibly have looked to those in the tower as something pretty much routine. Maybe this aircraft was doing a run-up, or maybe it needed to be moved across towards a maintenance area. Now, it should have asked for startup anyway, and who knows, maybe someone just forgot about that. But very soon, the controllers became aware that something definitely wasn't right here. This aircraft wasn't responding to any radio calls. It hadn't filed a flight plan, hadn't requested pushback and start, and hadn't coordinated anything with dispatch. So, as the plane pulled out onto taxiway Charlie, SeaTac tower controllers started concentrating all of their attention on this rogue aircraft. The Q400 quickly continued its unauthorized movement onto runway 16 center, all whilst the controllers tried desperately to get a response from it. Controller, aircraft on C lining up runway 16C. Say your call sign, they called over the radio, but there was no response. And at this point they had likely accepted that something definitely wasn't right here, but it was unclear how they were going to stop it. You see, once N499QX had started taxiing under its own power, it would have been incredibly dangerous to approach it. The Q400 has two 6-bladed propellers, measuring 3 meters in diameter. And even at idle, those blades are already spinning at around 1,000 revolutions per minute, so getting near them is not an option. I guess in theory, some kind of vehicle could have been used to block its path, if someone had been quick enough to think of that. But given that they didn't know the intention of the person in the cockpit, that would have also been extremely dangerous. What this all meant was that once Russell was moving, there was simply no good way to stop him, as he was now starting to line up his aircraft on runway 16 center, SeaTac Central Departure Runway. And at this point, an Alaska Airlines pilot, who was waiting for departure on the taxiway, jumped onto the frequency to report what he was seeing. AA pilot. His wheels are smoking left and right. And right now, he's rolling down the runway. He came flying out of the cargo area in front of Delta, and it's just a single pilot in there. And as a response, the tower controller just confirmed the obvious. Controller, alright, I'm not even talking to him. Now incredibly, not only had Russell been able to start up the aircraft and then taxi the big twin turboprop and line it up with the runway, he had apparently also been able to correctly configure the flaps, set the trim, set the proper alignment to automatic and rotate safely, all without any proper training. Now the reason that the wheels were smoking was likely due to side forces, as he tried to keep the aircraft steady down the center line without knowing what he was doing. Anyway, at time 1933, the stolen Q400 took off into the evening sky and initially then headed directly towards Mount Rainier, a huge volcano located southeast of Seattle, now easily visible in the setting evening sun, and for the first time since the 9/11 attacks. A passenger plane was now under control by an unauthorized person in U.S. skies, and that's after having been stolen from one of the busiest airports in the United States, a previously unthinkable scenario. Now, in normal circumstances, the airspace that airplanes use to fly in is a highly choreographed environment. Every aircraft flies according to a flight plan, talks to air traffic control, and follows clear instructions to avoid conflicts. But when someone enters that system unannounced with no flight plan and no intention of following procedures, everything quickly starts to break down. Air traffic controllers are trained to manage traffic within a predictable structure, not to deal with rogue aircraft acting without coordination. So even something as basic as airplane-to-airplane separation then becomes a nightmare, since you can't plan around someone who isn't playing by the same rules. Back on the ground, the Alaska Airlines pilots now called out, "AA pilot, tower, you need to call and scramble now." And what he meant by that was to scramble the U.S. Air Force's fighter jets. And the tower's reply came back short but clear. Controller, yeah, we are. Almost immediately, air traffic controllers had initiated emergency protocols. So seconds after the Q400 had left the runway, ATC at SeaTac had radioed, "Controller, everyone standing by for departure, just hold on with me for a second." And soon after, the FAA and Seattle Center also issued a ground stop for the entire area, and all planes in the air were ordered into holding patterns. But it took a few minutes before SeaTac ATC then decided that it was time to escalate this even further. This delay likely had to do with them prioritizing the safeguarding of all other traffic in the area, and also maybe because they were unsure about what was actually going on. No one really thinks stolen aircraft as a first explanation. Anyway, once they had decided to escalate, their first move was to call the North American Air Defense Command, or NORAD. Many people know NORAD from movies like War Games, but they actually monitor for all threats to airspace in North America, not just for missile attacks. This became especially true in the days after 9/11, when the threat of hijacking and the use of aircraft as weapons had shown itself to be very, very real. But activating them also posed a little bit of a risk here. If this actually was some sort of strange radio failure or a massive procedural misunderstanding, sending fighters to intercept the plane could be an added risk. So calling NORAD's Western Sector Control and telling them that the plane had been hijacked was not something that they wanted to take lightly. All of this meant that the first indications to NORAD were only that a plane had departed without authorization, and that's something that happens from time to time due to mistakes in communication, and is therefore not always taken so seriously. So this meant that initially there were no direct reactions to the call, other than to order the fighter pilots to suit up, basically to get ready. But the fighters didn't immediately get dispatched, and that was something that would later be highly criticized. About 10 minutes into the flight, the controllers were finally able to get in contact with Russell on the departure frequency, and his first statement on the radio was clarifying, if nothing else. To a question that wasn't recorded on the ATC tapes, Russell just responded, "Russell man, I'm a ground service agent. I don't know what that is. Start it up and get it to go. A couple hours, I guess. But yeah, I wouldn't know how to land it. I wasn't really planning on landing it." Now NORAD had been told about this situation about 7 minutes after the takeoff. So they were now tracking the flight and discussing what to do about it. And in response to this first radio contact, the controllers now called NORAD, again with an update. The pilot sounded suicidal. Now Russell's first maneuver with the aircraft took him around Mount Rainier, a sharp arcing turn around the 14,500-foot peak that temporarily made him disappear from radar, and all radio contact now dropped out briefly. But by time 1948, the Q400 then finally reappeared. Radio contact with Russell was intermittent at first, before ATC was then able to move him over to its own discrete channel. And after he had circled Mount Rainier and come back out again, Russell then pointed his Q400 back towards Puget Sound, and the aircraft appeared to be picking up speed. He then proceeded by starting to circling through the airspace around the Joint Base Lewis McChord, with his altitude shifting constantly between 6,000 and 15,000 feet. NORAD, which was now actively tracking him, feared that he might turn towards downtown Seattle, where thousands of people were at this very moment attending a Pearl Jam concert, and if he did, the consequences could obviously be catastrophic. Now there was no evidence that Russell had any intent of doing anything like that. But obviously they weren't taking any chances. So after the aircraft had been flying by itself for almost 15 minutes, the fighter jets were now finally dispatched. At time 20:08, the two F-15s took off from Portland International, and when authorized to go supersonic, the F-15s soon left a massive sonic boom behind them and intercepted Russell in only about 7 minutes. But they were not authorized to engage, at least not initially. At the moment, NORAD's determination was that Russell had no bad intent, but even knowing that, it was clear that he had no intention to even attempt a landing. He seemed to know how this would end for him, and that obviously wasn't good. All the while, the Seattle Center controllers continued to keep the communication going with him. As he had reappeared from behind the mountain, he started by apologizing and saying that he had needed to remove his mic because he had needed to throw up. "Russell, sorry, my mic came up. I threw up a little bit. Yeah, I shoot. Petter," he then continued by saying, "Russell, man, I'm sorry about this. I hope this doesn't ruin your day." The controller continued to keep up the conversation, and when they asked if he was comfortable with just flying the plane around, Russell responded with newfound confidence, "Controller, just flying the plane around. You seem comfortable with that." Russell, "Oh hell yeah. It's a blast, man. I played some video games before. So I know what I am doing a little bit." Petter, he then continued by proclaiming that everything is peachy, and he then gushed about how beautiful Mount Rainier was. He loved hiking and the nature. "Controller, okay, and you can see all the terrain around you. You got no issue with visibility or anything." Russell, "No, everything's peachy clean. Just did a little circle around Rainier. It's beautiful." After that, he exclaimed that he thought he had enough fuel to go and check out the Olympics, referring to another mountain range nearby. This comment also shows us that he knew where to check for how much fuel he had available, and given what he said, he must have realized that there was not that much left. He now also started indicating that he understood that the military must have been activated, because he asked if the controller was going to give him directions towards the jets. But when the controller assured him that this wasn't the case, that he was only trying to get him away from other traffic approaching SeaTac, Russell again apologized, saying, "Russell, oh, okay, yeah, I don't want to screw with that. I'm glad you're not screwing up everyone else's day on account of me." It is actually quite heartbreaking to read the transcripts from this conversation, because you can clearly see that this was not a man with an evil quest of any sort. His tone constantly changed between apologetic, excited, and scared, and he was likely now fully realizing the gravity of what he had set in motion. Now the controller tried to keep him focused and also suggested that he needed to start thinking about landing the aircraft safely. "Controller, there is the runway just off your right side in about a mile. Do you see that? That's McChord Field." Petter, but Russell just responded, "Oh man, those guys will rough me up if I tried landing there. I think I might mess something up there too. I wouldn't want to do that, Petter." And then, with fear in his voice, he called out, "Russell, oh, they probably got anti-aircraft." Petter, that was likely referring to anti-aircraft missiles that could maybe be used to shoot him down. But the controller calmly explained that they didn't have that stuff, and that they were only trying to help him to get down safely. To that, Russell answered that he wasn't ready to put it down just yet, and he also started referring to the fuel gauges going down quickly, which again indicates that he must have taken off with not that much fuel in his tanks. Russell, "Yeah, not quite ready to bring it down just yet, but, holy smokes. I gotta stop looking at the fuel 'cause it's going down quick. Petter. He now also started talking to the controller about what would happen to him if he were to actually land. Russell. This is probably like jail time for life. Huh, Petter. And he then added, Russell, I would hope it is. For a guy like me, giving a short glimpse into his quite dark mindset at that time. A while later, the controller also patched in a professional pilot to try and talk Russell through potential landing procedures. And when the pilot was introduced on the frequency, the controller also said out loud, ... Controller apparently, he is a ground cruiseman with Horizon, I guess. And right now, he's just flying around. And he just needs some help controlling his aircraft. Petter now to that. Russell jumped in and answered, Russell, nah, I mean, I don't need that much help. I played some video games before, Petter, but he also added, Russell, I would like to figure out how to get this cabin altitude. Like I know where the box is. I would like to know how to get some, make it pressurized, so I'm not so lightheaded. This shows that even though he had likely done quite a lot of simulator flying, he still didn't know the basic systems and controls of the aircraft that he was now flying. He didn't understand how to control the pressurization system, which is a basic system-level function for any trained pilot. And this actually brings me to an important point here, and something that I often get asked. While a simulator or video game might teach someone where the switches are or how to read the instruments, it can't teach them the underlying foundations of flying without further instruction, which would include the procedural knowledge needed, decision-making, and mindset required to operate the airliner's safety. Flying at this level isn't just about knowing what all of the buttons do. It's about understanding how to handle abnormal situations, how to manage workload under pressure, and how to think several steps ahead at all times. We pilots spend years of training and practicing, not just the mechanics of flight, but the discipline and judgment that keep passengers and crew safe. And the reality is that the unforgiving nature of real-world flying quickly separates those who merely think that they can fly from those who are trained and prepared to actually do it. So whilst flying flight simulators is a great hobby and can be very valuable as a training tool, you still need proper flight training to be safe. I actually tried instructing a friend of mine, Tom Scott, on how to land a Boeing 737, both with and without autopilot using a handheld radio. And you can check out how that went in a link I'll provide to you in the end of the video. Anyway, the pilot that air traffic control had brought in now tried to walk Russell through how to operate the air conditioning packs to pressurize the plane. There is 3 switches along the top of it. Make sure all 3 of those switches are in the down position, facing the nose of the airplane. We don't know if Russell actually followed these instructions, but he did keep flying, circling in big turning loops over the Seattle area. At one point, he also spotted the Washington State Ferry, the MV Galatane, crossing the Puget Sound in front of him. And that apparently gave him an idea. Dozens of passengers on board that ferry now suddenly noticed a white and navy turboprop banking down towards them, and the Q400 soon swept past the vessel at low altitude before climbing away just as quickly. Some on board feared that he might try to hit the ferry, but he didn't. He kept his distance. And this incident would mark the closest that Russell would actually come to hurting anyone on the ground. After bussing the MV Galatane, Russell had pulled his Q400 back into a climb. From the ground, it was an eerie sight, a large commercial aircraft flying erratically, but still under apparent control. Witness 1, that's a beep Alaska Airlines Q400. What the beep is he doing over here? Witness 2, I don't know. He should never be that low over here. Witness 3, no. At this point, the 2 F-15s who had been scrambled were following the aircraft closely, armed with both a cannon and missiles, and they were ready to take any action deemed necessary to protect the people down on the ground. The flight continued with disjointed communication for the next few minutes. The pilot in the tower tried to get some flight data like altitude and speed from Russell, but he just responded that he was kind of hand-flying it right now. He then complained about having something in his ear, before suddenly, from out of nowhere, angrily bursting out to the controller, Russell, damn it, Andrew, people's lives are at stake here. And that must have been the last thing that the controllers and the military wanted to hear. But the controller didn't flinch. He just said, Controller, all right, Rich, don't say stuff like that. Better. And Russell quickly responded by clarifying that he didn't want to hurt anyone. Russell, no, I don't want to hurt no one, Petter, and he then joked, Russell, I just want you to whisper sweet nothings to my ear. Petter. After that, the conversation took on a lighter tone as Russell asked the controller if he thought that Alaska Airlines would maybe offer him a job as a pilot if he pulled this off. Russell, hey, you think if I landed this successfully, Alaska would give me a job as a pilot? Pilot, you know, I think they would give you a job doing anything if you can pull this off. Russell, yeah, right. Now both the controller and the pilot tried to get Russell to consider a landing in the water, a ditching, but to that Russell just responded that he instead wanted the coordinates of an orca that had been in the news at the time, carrying its dead calf on its back and mourning, and Russell now really wanted to see that. Again, this just showed that this was far from a planned thing. He just seemed to be making things up as they came. His voice over the radio now also started to shift, and it seemed like his confidence, which had never been all that deep to begin with, had now finally started to crack. Russell, I got a lot of people that care about me. It's gonna disappoint them just to hear that I did this. I would like to apologize to each and every one of them. Just a broken guy. Got a few screws loose, I guess. Never really knew it, until now. Just ... Petter. But before long, the bravado returned to his voice again as he started talking about just how beautiful the mountain range below him was. Russell, man, have you been to the Olympics? These guys are gorgeous. Holy smokes, Petter. And when he started turning back towards the sudden south again, he suddenly called out, Russell, hey pilot guy, can this thing do a backflip you think? I think I'm gonna try to do a barrel roll, and if that goes good, I'm just gonna nose down and call it a night. The controller now, trying to maintain calm, urged him to reconsider. Before you do that, let's think about this, the controller said. I've got another pilot coming up to help you out. But it was now already happening. At around time 2030, Russell climbed steeply to about 5,000 feet, and he then pulled the yoke back, rolled the aircraft, inverted, and completed a full barrel roll, something that I think that no one expected him to be able to do. And somehow the Q400 also held together as he pulled out of the dive only about 10 feet above the water. This crazy maneuver was also captured by witnesses on their mobile phones, with the footage showing the aircraft entering and exiting the roll smoothly without stalling or spinning. And just behind the Q400, two F-15s could be seen following, still ready to do whatever was necessary, but now with two slightly impressed fighter pilots inside, or at least that's what the incredulous communication between them showed later on. Now these two F-15s were the whole time close enough to see him directly. They were there to watch, to shadow him, and to act only if absolutely necessary. And the military's concern hadn't gone away here. Russell was still flying near urban areas, still unpredictable, something that latest stunt really had confirmed. Hey, I did that, Russell said, and was audibly proud of himself. I was thinking like, I'm gonna screw this up and crash into something, but holy smokes, I pulled it off. But even after this big aerobatic achievement, Russell never showed any real interest in landing. Over the next 10 minutes, air traffic control offered him multiple options. McCord, Air Force Base, Boeing Field, even the open runways at Tacoma Narrows, but each time he declined. Below him stretched the jagged ridgelines and alpine lakes of Olympic National Park, fading into the twilight. And that was the last clear location that he would mention on the tapes. The tone of his voice now softened further. Regret had crept in completely now, overtaking his jokes and The controller tried a few times to connect with Russell on a human level, engaging with him a little when Russell asked about hiking the Olympic mountains that were visible out through his windscreen. But the last message recorded from Russell was something cryptic. Russell, not for long, I feel like one of my engines is going out or something. And that could possibly indicate that he had finally run out of fuel. Around this time, the plane turned again, moving back south, then west again, and there would be no more radio calls after this. Finally, at time 2046, after a total of nearly 75 minutes in the air, the Q400 suddenly descended rapidly and crashed into a wooded area on Ketron Island, a sparsely populated stretch of land in the southern Puget Sound. No one on the ground was injured, but the aircraft was immediately destroyed and Richard Russell was killed instantly. Calm music. The NTSB, reading from the flight data recorder, later confirmed that the crash was likely intentional. It showed the aircraft in a significant sideslip during the final minute, which could have been due to that engine failure that Russell had alluded to. But it remained controllable throughout the last few seconds, and the investigator noted that if Russell had wanted to avoid impact, he still had the time and energy to pull back on the controls, raise the nose, and initiate a climb. But instead, the control column stayed forward of neutral and moved even further forward during the last seconds before the impact. The final act of the flight, though devastating, had spared others. The location, whether by design or accident, ensured that the damage ended only with him. The impact was visible from the mainland, and within minutes, emergency responders were en route towards Ketron Island. The fireball had ignited a blaze in the woods, but there was nothing anyone could do in terms of life-saving. The aircraft had completely disintegrated on impact, and Richard Russell was gone. That night, law enforcement officials made their way to his family's home to deliver the horrible news. The FBI, the NTSB, and the TSA all launched concurrent investigations. And across the aviation world, one question rang louder than any other. How could this have happened? In the days that followed, pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. Russell had no known history of mental illnesses. He left behind no note, no manifesto, no evidence of a political or ideological motive. He had not coordinated with anyone, and he had not made any threats. He was just a quiet guy who made funny videos and worked hard. So, because of this, He hadn't been flagged, he wasn't even watched, he had simply stolen an airplane. In 2019, the FBI released its final report, confirming that Russell had acted alone. No security breaches occurred beyond the access that he had already been granted, and even in hindsight, the FBI was unsure if there was any way anyone could have known that he would do this, which was obviously one of the most chilling parts of this whole story. Now it's important to understand here that the whole aviation business runs on trust. Pilots trust controllers, dispatchers trust crews, maintenance personnel trust the logbooks, and all of us, without really saying it, trust that nobody is going to abuse that access that they have been given. And that's the system that Russell slipped through. He didn't break in, he didn't sneak past security, he just used the badge that he already had, climbed into a parked airplane, and flew. And that, I think, shook something up in all of us. Not just because of what he did, but because of what it possibly meant. In a system that was built to keep threats out, no one had accurately planned for a threat that was already in. Since then, changes have been made to access policies, surveillance protocols, and insider threats training. There are more safeguards now, especially around parked aircraft and lone workers. And many airlines and airports now have a two-person rule, making sure that no one individual is allowed to move in an area around an aircraft by themselves. And maybe that's enough to make another incident like this less likely, because to be honest, this was pretty unique. And because we haven't seen any more of these, maybe the system is still working. But I think that the most important change isn't in the policies. No, it's in the mindset of everyone in the business. Because this story isn't about failure, it's about humility. It should remind us that even in a world of procedures and protocols, we are still human. And that trust, that very thing that our system relies on, is not something that you can lock up in a cabinet or tag with a badge. It has to be earned, checked, and watched. Most importantly, let's remember to look out for one another. A kind word or a moment of support can make all the difference, especially since the ones struggling the most aren't always the easiest to recognize. If you or someone you know is in need of help, please don't hesitate to reach out. We've linked suicide hotlines and resources in the description below, because no one should have to face difficult times alone. I also want to acknowledge the effort that went into creating this episode, and extend my gratitude to those who helped make it possible. Your support allows us to share important stories like this one, and I'm deeply thankful for it.